Hello dear friends, thanks for joining me. Today we look at Psalm 126. Let me read it for us. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter and our tongue with shouts of joy. Then they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us. We are glad. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like streams in the Negev. Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come back with shouts of joy, bringing sheaves with him. Now, as we've been working through these psalms, we've mentioned things like repetition, imagery, structure of the psalm, the arrangement of the material, keeping an eye open for what the purpose of the psalm is. Again today we see, as in Psalm 125, we see that this particular psalm is a prayer. Verse 4, restore our fortunes, O Lord. That's the prayer, and not just from the pilgrim himself, but from the pilgrim on behalf of the people. If you look at verse 1 and verse 4, you'll notice the repetition of a reference to restored fortunes. Do you see that there in verse 1? When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, so looking back at Zion and its fortunes. Verse 4, restore our fortunes, O Lord. So what does that tell us about the psalm? The psalm reflects on God having done something for Zion, for Jerusalem. Perhaps it's a reference to the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple under Ezra and Nehemiah in the time after the exile. So as they reflect upon God's restoration of Zion, that restoration, that act of God in the past, becomes the basis of a prayer for the future, or rather, shall I say, for the present. Now, the restoration of Zion is, of course, and was very important in Israel's history because of that connection between Zion and the temple and the place where God dwells. It was the place, as we've seen already, where the pilgrims went. But the interesting thing about this psalm is that it underlines the fact that the restoration of the temple or the rebuilding of Jerusalem in and of itself was not the most important thing. That the temple should be rebuilt, of course, was important. That Zion should have been restored was, of course, important. And we know from the story of Ezra and Nehemiah and the prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi just how important that was. But notice how the psalmist understands that the real restoration, the real renewal, actually has to happen within the people. The very things that caused Zion to be destroyed in the first place, people's hearts turned away from the Lord, that is the thing that needs to be resolved so that there's not a repetition of the judgment which befell Jerusalem and Zion at the time of the exile. So the psalmist understands that far more important than a building being rebuilt or a town being renewed, most important of all, is that the hearts of the people be restored. The restore our fortunes, that phrase which is used in verse 1 and again in verse 4, is a very, very important phrase within the prophetic literature, but also in the Psalms. Just turn with me to Psalm 85, would you? Psalm 85, verse 1 to 3. Listen to this language. Lord, you were favorable to your land. You restored the fortunes of Jacob. Again, this could well be a reference to post-exile. Look at verse 2, though. You forgave the iniquity of your people, and you covered all their sin. You withdrew all your wrath and turned from your hot anger. Can you see how that could so easily be a reflection on what God did when he allowed Israel to return from exile and the temple to be rebuilt? So, Lord, you did this. And then verse 4 of Psalm 85, restore us again, O God of our salvation, and put away your indignation toward us. Will you be angry with us forever? So can you see that in Psalm 85 and again in Psalm 106, we have exactly the same idea. God has done something, a restoration, which involves actually the restoring of fortunes, involves forgiveness, the turning away of wrath, the renewal of people in their relationship with God. And God, who has done this once before, the plea, the cry is that the Lord will do it again for the people in their own day. Notice the imagery of the psalm. So there's a lot of reference that you see to laughter, joy, shouts of joy. Again, in verse 5, shouts of joy, joy and laughter, again in verse 6. So the picture is of joy and laughter in the place of weeping, verse 6, and tears, verse 5. Do you see that image? So what we have here is a reversal of fortunes. As God restores the fortunes of both Zion and his people, he not only restores the fortunes, but he actually reverses the fortunes. What was weeping and tears will give way to laughter and joy. What was wrath will give way to salvation. What was unforgiven sin will give way to forgiveness. So this psalm, this song, reflects on God's restoring power, but then uses God's restoration power and the fact that God has done this before as a great basis for a prayer that God will revive or renew or restore his people. Like streams in the Negev. Again, see that image? What a wonderful image of a flowing river in a dry land. The seeds which now bear harvest and bringing home the sheaves of corn. This guarantee of a great harvest. Now, why has God done this in the past, and why does the psalmist pray that God will restore the fortunes of his people? Well, of course, the first thing that's in his mind is the people themselves. They need restoring. They need restoration. They need revival. Certainly, we would say that that is true in our day, that we need God by his Spirit to pour out a new spiritual awakening across our land, across our city, and even within our church, within our own lives. During this period of lockdown, it's very easy, is it not, to grow spiritually cold. Perhaps to begin to neglect church because church is online and who's going to hold you accountable. Perhaps to neglect fellowship because, having a Zoom group is so hard. Perhaps to neglect personal Bible reading and prayer. Neglect our evangelistic witness. Whatever it happens to be, it's very easy for us in these times to grow cold. What we need is revival. We need awakening. We need to be restored. And not having our fortunes restored merely in terms of the economy opening up or circumstances changing, but having our spiritual fortunes restored. So it's a great prayer for us for today. And we need that. And of course, in verse 3, when the Lord does these great things, God's people are made glad. They do have rejoicing and praise and worship and honor. But will you notice that in verse 2, when God restores his people, when he brings spiritual revival and awakening, one of the consequences is that among the nations, they will say, the Lord has done great things for them. Isn't that striking? In other words, the joy and the restoration and the sense of well-being and gladness and peace that comes into the lives of believers when God works in their lives, either bringing them to faith in Jesus or renewing and strengthening our faith so that we can keep moving towards maturity. When God works by his Spirit to do that in our lives, one of the consequences is that it becomes a witness to the watching world. And above all, in these great pilgrim songs, it's very important to realize that the psalmist does not forget Israel's evangelistic responsibility. It's very easy to read these psalms merely as being about Israel, about the temple, about Jerusalem, about the pilgrim, about the people being able to do church, everybody else doing their thing. Often, the psalmist, as we've seen, feels the burden of contempt and scorn among the nations. But that burden expresses itself ultimately in a deep desire for God's name to be honored among the peoples. In the story of Elijah and Elisha, which is and the people of Israel were the prophets of Baal in the days of Ahab and Jezebel. It's one of the great stories of restoration in 2 Kings. And the very interesting thing in the prayer that Elijah prays in that time when on Mount Carmel, remember the famous story where there is a terrible picture of Israel's rebellion and hardness of heart and all of that. When we read, did I say 2 Kings? Let me just find the correct reference here quickly so that we don't. It's 1 Kings, not 2 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 18, where Elijah confronts Ahab and the people of Israel. Sorry about that. In this chapter, this famous chapter, when Elijah prays so that the people may be restored or renewed, listen to what he prays. Verse 36 of 1 Kings chapter 18. And at the time of the offering of oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I've done all things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are the one that is turning their hearts back. And then the fire fell from heaven. Now look at what Elijah prays there. He prays that the people will know that God has restored them, and that God is the one who is restoring them. But he also prays that it must be known that God is God in Israel. Before Ahab, before Jezebel, before the prophets of Baal, before all the unbelievers watching this whole business. Elijah's prayer is that God's name and God's honor may be known in the world. Ultimately, our evangelism is not just so that people may be saved. Our evangelism is not just because we need to do evangelism, which is a Christian privilege and indeed a Christian duty. In the end, God's ministry in the world and our evangelistic ministry in the world is for the sake of God's glory and God's honor. In an earlier series of afternoon teas, we looked at Romans, where in Romans chapter 1, Paul says that he's set apart for the gospel for the sake of obedience amongst all the nations for his, that is God's name's sake. So why should we be burdened and concerned with sharing the gospel with the world? Why should God restore us to full spiritual health and well-being? For ourselves, yes, but also so that God's renown and God's honor may be known in the world, and so that other people may come to experience God's great restoring joy, so that they who have gone out sowing with tears may actually reap with joy as God brings them into his kingdom. Jesus tells that parable of the word as seed, and how this sowing and reaping is a great picture of how the word bears fruit in people's lives for the glory of God. Thank you for joining me. This, of course, 126 is the last psalm that we'll do for this week. We look forward to picking it up again next week with Psalm 127.